My name is Vanessa Willardson with BYU-Idaho Radio, and today joining me in the studio is Terry Bohle Montague, who is the author of Mine Angels Roundabout. It covers the story of the missionaries serving in Germany at the time of the beginning of World War II. Thank you so much for joining me today, Terry. I'm so excited to talk to you about this book. Can you tell me a little bit about how you were inspired to create Mine Angels Roundabout?
It started because I had a biology class in high school with Terry Bohle. He sat behind me. I was a sophomore, and someone came up to him just before class started and said, "Is it true your dad was a missionary in Nazi Germany?" Well, Nazi and missionary just don't go into the same sentence very well. And that caught my attention. And then later, about 10 years later, I was looking for a topic for an article, and I remembered that. I was living in Rupert at the time, had finished college, and I knew that Norm Bohle, Jerry's father, just lived 2 miles down the canal from me. He was, for 12 years, our county commissioner. So I knew who he was. I'd worked with him before in my public relations. And so I thought, I'll just give him a call, see if he wants to talk about it. And I was thinking about an 800-word article, maybe 1,200. And so then we started the interview, which was the anniversary of the evacuation, the 35th, I think, anniversary of the evacuation. And after sitting there for 2 hours and recording his story, I'm thinking, this is going to be a lot more work than a 1,200-word article, because he was mentioning names, he was mentioning places, he was mentioning events. He was talking about his mission president. He was talking about Joseph Fielding Smith, who happened to be in Germany that week on his honeymoon. And I was thinking, now how am I going to verify all of this? And I said to Norm, do you know where any of these other people are so I can talk to them? And he just said no. And so at that point, I was thinking, okay, maybe I can find these people. And then he looked at me and he shook his finger at me and he said, you better get this right or people will think you have bubbles in your brain. Oh. I think, oh man, maybe I've got bubbles in my brain already for taking this on. It did. Finding those evacuated missionaries after they had left the mission field like 40 years earlier, it took me 5 years to track them down.
Wow.
And no kidding. And to get the piece written. And we decided what we would do is, when I had all the interviews, I felt like we covered everything because I could not find every person. There were some who had passed away. A couple of them had left the church, didn't want to talk to me. But what I did not know, and Norm didn't tell me, is that while the missionaries were in Denmark, while they were waiting to see what was going to happen with Hitler in Poland, Joseph Fielding Smith was meeting with the missionaries every morning, and they were having kind of a devotional. But during those devotionals, he told them, and their mission president, it was M. Douglas Wood, told them, you do not talk about anything that happened to you while you were in Germany. Do not talk about Nazis. Do not talk about the members. And, of course, what they were trying to do was protect the church and protect the members. Well, some of them took that to heart, and right to their dying day, they didn't talk about it to anybody. So it was a little difficult to get the story from them. And some of them would tell me a story right up to a certain incident. By the time I got to the end of this, I knew how this story should go. But there was a group of them who talked right up to, well, we got to the ferry and then we went to Denmark, and that's all they'd say. And it was like a donut hole. I knew there was something else that happened there, But I couldn't get anybody to talk about it until I talked to J. Richard Barnes, who was the mission president's executive secretary. And then he told me about the incident with the train. When I brought it up to other people, they just kind of looked at me like, but they did not want to talk about it. They did not want to talk about it. They weren't going to talk about it because they could see that this would be reflect badly on the church, or maybe reflect badly on President Wood. I don't know. But it was hard to get anybody to talk about that incident. But J. Richard Barnes, he stepped up and told me. And that's when you see the movie or when you read the book, you will see that story in there about how they stole the engine. Well, they went to a ferry. They knew they had to be at the ferry at a certain time. And as they approached it, they could see that it was leaving. The crew had gotten off of the train. When I asked people, they said, well, they were probably getting off to have lunch or something. But they got off the train, and the train was left sitting there on the tracks, and that the ferry was leaving. They knew that there were borders had closed. They were sure that Denmark was going to be closing, and they just needed to get there. And so that's what they did.
How did these evacuations start? I'm curious to know, just from your perspective, how the mission president started these evacuations.
In 1938, Nazi Germany was going to just march in and take over Czechoslovakia. And everybody was terrified there was going to be another war. They had World War I there, and it was horrible. It was horrible for the civilian. It was horrible for everybody. Nobody wanted that to happen. So Chamberlain, who was then the Prime Minister of England, made this deal with Hitler that they would allow Nazi Germany to take over Czechoslovakia if they promised that that's all they were going to do. Well, I think we all think that people are honest, but that was a big lie. And still worried that there was going to be a war, they evacuated the European missions in 1938, and they sent them, the German missionaries, they sent into Holland, and they waited there for a month. And then they said, oh, well, it looks like it's okay. And they went back. They went back in as missionaries. The missionaries would tell you that even though they'd signed this peace agreement with the Allies, which would be the United States, Great Britain, and France, they could see that they were building up an army. People were getting drafted. They were building tanks and trucks, and they were storing things. So in 1939, after watching all of this, watching maneuvers, watching airplanes going over, and they weren't even supposed to be building airplanes or any kinds of munitions or any kind of war vehicles. And yet the missionaries were seeing this. They knew they were going to have to be leaving again. So just kind of out of the blue, this was after some worldwide things that happened, President Grant tried calling each of the missions and saying, it's time for us to evacuate again. When he did that and he tried to contact the West German mission, he could not get through. And that's because the government had taken over the phone lines and the wires. That's the way mostly people communicated, was by telegraph. Mm-hmm. And so President Grant called Hugh B. Brown, who was the mission president in England at the time, and told him to get a message over to the German missions and tell them to get out now. And So that's what he did. He called the West German Mission Office, which was in Frankfurt. At that time, President Wood and Sister Wood had gone north into Germany to pick up Joseph Fielding Smith and his new wife and bring them down into Germany for a tour of the mission. And it wasn't just an accident that Joseph Fielding Smith was there. And it might have been his honeymoon, and he might have been making a nice tour, but he was absolutely needed there. And he presided over the evacuations with the East German missions, the Czechoslovakian mission, the West German mission, and then ultimately the rest of the countries of Europe. So that's how that started. And having President Wood in the north of Germany then, he telegraphed his mission office, and the staff there started sending out the telegrams to get out now. And it says, leave immediately. It doesn't say, well, pack up your laundry and assign some new mission president or some new branch presidents. He said, immediately, take your trunks with you. Take all your belongings with you. I had a friend once ask me, why would they stop to take their stuff? But it was because those missionaries' families had worked so hard through the Depression to be able to afford missions for their sons and daughters that leaving their belongings behind would have been a huge blow. As it turned out, a lot of them lost their luggage anyway, and as they were reassigned to different missions in the United States, they had to borrow their companions' clothes to finish. And then they got home and found that their trunks did show up at their parents' houses. Some of their parents didn't even know how in the world they got there. But what happened was that Irma Rosenhan, who was one of the first missionaries out, and just by hook and crook, she managed to get into Holland. When all of those trunks started showing up, Irma gathered up all the trunks and forwarded on to the missionaries' homes back in the United States. So there are the families waiting to hear where their sons and daughters are, and instead they're getting all of their luggage. And it took a while to get that straightened out. But, it was just one of the things they had to deal with.
You were saying you were having some trouble getting these stories from these missionaries. How did you end up gathering the stories, or how are you able to get them to open up?
Well, first I had to find them. And in those days, there was no internet. And so what I would do is when I found one, and what was interesting is that I live in Rupert. Well, we had Norm Siebold just down the canal from us. And J. Ralph Thompson was down the highway on the way to Burley. And Sylvan Berge was in Burley. And Dwayne Ward was up the mountain in Elmo. So, there were those people who were there around me, and I could say to them, do you know where so-and-so was? Do you know where so-and-so was? And they'd say yes, or they'd say no, and then I'd go on to the next one. But the thing that was the biggest help was that when the missionaries in the Frankfurt mission office received word that they were to evacuate, they started packing up their stuff, and they had to get it to the train, and there were no taxis or buses that were going to help them, so they had to carry their luggage or find a cart of some kind. But in the middle of all of that, somebody in that mission office took a list of the missionaries' names and their hometowns and put them in a folder. And then they put, the mission was new, it was only months old, and so there wasn't a lot of material. They deposited those records in August of 1939 in the basement of the mission office. The mission office was a 3-story stone building right next to the River Mont. And so then in 1945, in May, that's when the United States marched into what was left of Frankfurt, and it was rubble. It was just rubble. At the time, Ken Earl, who was one of the evacuated West German missionaries, got permission to go into Frankfurt and see what was left, see if anything was left of the mission office. He took a Jeep and he went into Frankfurt and was stunned to see that that building was still standing. It was surrounded by rubble. It was surrounded by bomb craters. He got out of his Jeep. He walked around the building, went around, looked in the window. The doors were locked. Then he realized there was somebody inside of the building. This is a big building. He got them to open the door and discovered that the people who were living in the mission office building were members of the church who'd been bombed out of their homes. And that building had protected them throughout the war. So he was glad to see them, of course. But he said, does anybody know where the records are? And somebody said, they're probably still in the basement. He went down there, and there they were. And in it was, I think, 4 pages with a list of each missionary and his hometown. So he took it back to the base, put it in a box, mailed it to the church offices in Salt Lake. They put it in their archives, and that's where it was when I found it. And that was the greatest help in finding them because, like I said, there was not internet, but I thought if somebody lived in this town, if I contact the school district office in that town, they'll know where that person is or his family. And that's what worked the best. That's what worked the best. And of course, there was no privacy issues then, so I would just call a school district office and say, I'm looking for this and such. Do you have an address you can share with me? And they'd say, sure. And that's how I found them. The church is very protective of personal information about each one of the members, so they were not going to help me. I knew that. But those 3 pieces of paper, and you'll see a copy of that list in the movie. I sent a copy to TC, and you'll see them going down the list, and that's the list that was actually in the basement of the mission office.
Wow.
But other ways that I found him was just by, so there was one missionary, he had a common last name. It started with W, and I had learned that if I was going somewhere out of town, I could stop in that town at a library and run in and look in their phone books. So I found some of those that way. But I was down to one of the last ones, and the last name on the list, and we were coming home from camping up above Boise. And my husband pulled into a gas station, this little dinky town. And I thought, I better go look. I mean, I was tired and I wanted to go home, but I thought, no, I better go look. So I ran into the gas station. I said, do you have a phone book? And I started going down. I started at the A's, first page, going down the list, down the list, down the list, turn the page, go down 2 more lists, and the last name on the last page at the bottom of the list was Grant Weber, one of my missionaries that I hadn't found.
Wow. And
I think I shrieked. I think I might have screamed. I think that the people in the other 2 houses in the town heard me. But that was part of it, is that just, I mean, it wasn't like a needle in the haystack. It was like trying to find a haystack before you could even look for the needle.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness.
So I know. And so then I had to go, so then I would make an appointment to interview. Some of them didn't want to be interviewed. The ones that were okay with me interviewing them in their homes, I'd take a tape recording and we'd record it. I remember I found Vern Merritt through the school district. And so I wrote him. I had you could get these little postcards from the post office. You put the address on one side of them, and then you write a note on the back. So I wrote to him and told him who I was and what I was doing, and would he agree to an interview. So I get another one of those postcards back within the same week, and he wanted to know my stake president's name and phone number and my bishop's name and phone number. I thought, well, okay, that's good to be safe, I guess. So I sent it to him, and in the return mail, I got a 45-minute tape, and he told the most incredible story. I was just and after I listened to it, I went to my husband and said, I think we need to go down to Utah. I need to talk to this man. So he said, okay. Well, my husband, he could find his way out of a rat's maze. He always gets me where I need to be. And he took me right up to the door, and I didn't know what I was walking into, but I walked up and rang the doorbell, and it was a house that had an enclosed porch. So you walked out of the living room onto the porch and then opened the porch door. So I see him coming through the porch, and it didn't exactly look like his picture. I could see who he was, but this man was frail. And he pushed the door open, and he grabbed me by the hand, and he pulled me up the steps, and he said, "Are you Terry?" And I said, "Are you Vern?" And we both laughed, and he said, "I knew you would come. I always knew you would come." And I was kind of surprised. And he said, somebody was going to come. Somebody was going to come. And he took me into his home, and there was a circle of people sitting there.
Oh.
And he introduced me to each one of them, and they were all of his children and even a grandchild who was sitting there. And he said, Joseph Fielding Smith told us we should never tell. And he said, and I never did. I was waiting for you. And he said, this is the first time they're going to hear it. I was thinking, what if I hadn't found him? You know, what if I hadn't come? What if I had had an excuse, or what if I couldn't have found his address, or that story would be lost to his whole family. And so anyway, his was a story that I particularly am amazed by, besides Norm's story, of course. But that was the way that I just did it. I told him who I was. Some of the others were a little bit reluctant, but when I went to the interview, I showed up in a pretty summer dress, my cute sandals, and I probably looked like, you know, one of those cute BYU co-eds.
Yeah.
And I think that helped a lot. I think that helped a lot because I didn't look intimidating. I deliberately went looking like I was on my way to homemaking meeting. Mm-hmm. But something else interesting that happened was that a lot of them had either married, well, several of them had married German girls. Others of them had cousins or relatives who were German. And some of those people sat in on the interviews. And I was prepared with a list of questions. I knew what the history was, and so I had some really good questions. And that's always something that's important if you are going to be interviewing somebody. You need to have some background, some solid background. So I would say to them, well, do you know about this, or do you know about that, or what was your experience here? And he would say, well, just a minute, I've got to go get my album or my journal or my diary. And he'd get up and leave. And then these women who were sitting there would say, let me tell you what happened to me. And so I was hearing these stories about LDS members of the church who were Germans and had to live through that. And I did not have, that was not going to fold into the evacuation story. But I kept that information, and then I wrote a novel. It's called Fireweed, and it's been published by Covenant. But it's based on the LDS woman's perspective of being a German in Nazi Germany. So there was just lots and lots of things that happened, lots of people I met, lots of stories that I heard. Some of them were hard to hear.
So from the beginning, when you started gathering these interviews and stories to when you published this book, how long did that take you?
5 years.
5 years? Wow. I would think it would take longer. Oh my goodness. You must have worked.
Let me tell you that after 5 years, we decided that we would self-publish this book so that the missionaries would have enough copies for themselves and their families. Mm-hmm. So that was great. It sold out within a couple of weeks, and that particular, the first edition is kind of a collector's item. I've seen them priced at $600, which is and so then in the meantime, about 10, 12, 15 years later, I'm starting to get phone calls from the family members who are saying, my grandfather died, my dad died, my mother died, and we would like to have more copies. So we self-published another one, and in the meantime, some of the stories became more defined. I heard other things. I talked to other people, and so then we added a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And so then the second edition came out, and those sold out pretty fast. I think we did maybe 5,000. And then someone sent a copy to that second book to TC, and he had it in his cabinet for quite a while, I think, in his file. He has lots of stuff like that. And he thought he was interested in that, and his partner, who is also his cousin, urged him to go forward with it. When the first edition came out, I talked to Lee Roddy about it. And Lee Roddy was a television scriptwriter as well as a screenwriter. And maybe you know him by, he did the Apple Dumpling movies. He did something on TV that had to do with a boy and a bear. I don't remember what that was. Anyway, I met him at a writer's camp. And he said, if I had a story like that, I'd skip around the room clapping my hands. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe this has a little bit of, for other people, it might be interesting.
Yeah.
So along the way, he introduced me to a Hollywood filmmaker, and I was less than impressed by him. I just got this feeling like, because I felt very protective about those missionaries. I didn't want anything to be fictionalized about their lives. I wanted it to be the truth. And I was afraid of what that guy would do, and it would be disrespectful to my missionaries. I couldn't do that. And their families maybe too. So I just walked away from that. I did hear from an LDS director, and he looked at it and said, I don't know where I get the funds to do this. This would be too expensive to me. I thought, okay, that's fine. The third one was a Dutch movie maker, and he had these ideas but he said, we'll have to have those missionaries have their girlfriends with them on the train. No.
Girlfriends.
And so I let that go. Yeah. So then about that time, TC was thinking about it, I think. So he didn't know how to get hold of me. He knew that the second book he had a copy of had been printed by Granite. And he knew Jeff Lamson from Granite, and Jeff at the time was the mayor of Orem. And he called him and asked if he could get my phone number. And so Jeff called me. I was out sweeping the patio, and he said, "Do you know who T.C. Christensen is?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I do." And he said, "Well, he wants to talk to you." I said, "Okay." So I figured, okay, we'll see. Still sweeping the patio, and I get a phone call, and he says, "This is T.C. Christensen. Do you know who I am?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." He said, "Do you feel like doing a movie?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so."
And that's how it began.
Yep, that's how it began, and it just happened that he said, "I need to get the legal papers together, and then I need to have you come and sign them." And so I said, "Well, my husband and I are going up to Park City to a family reunion next weekend." And of course, he just lives right, the road goes right past TC's house. So on the way to Park City, we stopped and said, "Hello, how are you?" and signed the documents. And I gave him a gift of my fireweed novel, and he gave me a gift of some of his movies, of which I then had probably 3 copies.
Like, oh, thank you.
Yeah, no kidding. And then we went up to Park City, and I just thought, and then we had to go another 5 years because there was war in Europe, there was COVID, and I think it was discouraging for TC, and occasionally I felt a little down about it, but I knew what we had to get through to tell that story, and it always worked out. It always worked out. So I was relieved that we were able to share that with people, and I was relieved that those missionaries who went out with the idea that they were going to preach and teach and testify and baptize, and they get into a country where all of that is illegal. And they did not have the opportunity to do that, to do what they were called to do. And then when they got home, they weren't allowed to talk about what had happened to them. And so many of those things that happened to them were miraculous, but they weren't to talk about them. And I felt that if I told the story, or TC told the story, or somebody else, or you tell the story, then those young men and those young women are able to preach and teach and testify. And I think that's why we do it, don't we?
Mm-hmm. You were able to be on the set for Escape from Germany. What was that like?
It was fun. It was so much fun. I hadn't met all of the missionaries' ancestors, but so many of them were there. I knew so many of them. I hadn't seen some of them for years. And so that was just the coolest part of that. TC knew that I had this huge notebook full of contact information, so he said, "Could you share that so that we can get some extras together?" And I thought maybe I better call him before I'd just turn over phone numbers and stuff. So I think I spent 2 months talking to those people that I feel so close to, and still am close to. I kept track of all those missionaries during their lifetimes, and then their kids, and now their grandkids. And that was great, just being with them and seeing them and sharing that with them. It was very touching, and TC was so kind and so gracious, and he's just a really generous person. I mean, he knows what he's doing, and when he's focused on it, stand back.
Yeah.
But he was so kind to everybody.
Did he go to you a lot for checking if things were accurate in the movie?
He did. He checked. I went over his first draft, probably the second and third ones. Just added comments. He was sticking really close to that story. Made some comments about how this thing would have been said, or how that thing would have been said in German. he'd ask me about a name or a person or what did this person do in their life, and so then I'd send that to him. And having known them for a while, known for all those years, I could pretty much tell him whatever he wanted to. What he got a big kick out is that he found a couple of things that I didn't know.
Oh, wow. I think you would know quite a bit, but yeah. What surprised you?
Oh, let's see. Oh, that list of missionaries was not complete. There were about 3 of them that weren't on that list, but they were so new in the mission, probably one of the secretaries hadn't entered it onto the list. Really? And so there were a couple of them floating around out there that I didn't know about. But I did manage to collect a story from one of those that I didn't know about. And one of them told me that he had only been in the mission for 2 weeks, and so he really couldn't say very much. He didn't know what was going on. And that was basically those other 3 that I was looking for. That there wasn't much mentioned in their journals or their diaries about what had happened. So, but that was okay. I have their names now. And as I go to premieres and screenings, and we've done firesides, and I've done family home evening groups and Relief Society groups. As I go and do that, somebody will come up and say, "Oh, that was my great uncle," or that was my. And so then I get a chance to talk to them and say, "Well, what did he tell you about this?" Or what did you feel about that when you heard that? So then I have a chance to hear some more. And I've got 2 of them sitting right here. People have sent me excerpts from their relatives. In one case, it was a woman's uncle's cousin on the other side of the family, so I've got that. But the hardest part, I think, was when they were told, "Don't talk about it." And then some of them never did, but some of them did realize that maybe this would be good for the church in this time. And I think by watching the audiences, and I like to stand in the hallway and watch them as they were watching the movies. They would watch the movie and they did not move. It looked like a whole bunch of mannequins sitting there. They didn't move until the end. And then it was like jumping up and applauding, and some of them were crying.
Wow.
But they were so intent on it. And I thought, well, this is why the Lord has held it back for this long. Because we need it now. We need heroes now. And I think that filled that need. And I'm so pleased that even though, what I was doing was just gathering this stuff, and only a few people knew about it very much, family members mostly, but I got to be part of that. I got to be part of allowing them to do their missionary work. I got to be part of having their family members recognize what their relative had done. And I got to be part of a whole new generation, 2 generations of people who did not know that an everyday Joe from some little Idaho town could stand up to such a formidable enemy like those Nazis. And of course, there were Nazis who were members of the church, and I'm not talking about them, but I'm talking about the ones that meant to do wicked in the world. And they were able to stand up to them. A lot of those missionaries were arrested while they were on their missions. One Grant Baker, he he decided he was going to go out and do some real missionary work, so he took his brand new companion and said, "We're going tracting." And they got arrested.
Oh, oh no.
Because Americans were spies. Americans were spies.
Oh my gosh.
And so they went to another part of the town and started tracting, and they got arrested again. And the third time, the police who arrested him put him in a car, took him out in the country, and told them what happened in concentration camps.
Really?
And then they went back to their room, and they went through everything in the apartment, including their mattresses, and told them they didn't want to see him again or they were going to go to prison. And so then Grant called President Wood, and President Wood got him out of there. But
oh my gosh, what a scary time.
Well, yeah, it was like they couldn't even take a deep breath. Some of them joined Hitler's Youth while they were there, just so they would have contact with someone, a German, who might say to them, "Well, what are you doing here?" And then they could tell them what they were doing there. But other than that, no. Wow. So it was. The general authorities tell us we can do hard things. Well, we've got a whole history of doing hard things, and it should make us feel like, yeah, I can do that too.
That's just an incredible story. And you were really the first person to gather these stories together and tell it. Had anyone tried to access this list of missionaries before you came to it?
Not that I know of. Somebody did. There were two people at BYU who knew the stories because of those young men, there were quite a group of them that went back to BYU. Some of them became professors. They were using the GI Bill, you see. And so there are a lot of doctors, lawyers, a variety of professions represented there because of the GI Bill. And so there have been a couple of people who have written stories about this individual or that individual. But no, not altogether. Not all of the stories altogether. So, because I don't think you could understand the depth of the story just by hearing one account. And I didn't want to just offer somebody one account, because if you made a mistake in that, it would reflect back on the person who told you the story, or you could be accused of just making it up. And I don't like to do things that way. I want to have a verification, and I kept names and dates and even times. I kept a list of the questions that I asked and their answers and phone calls that were made. Just so, and if you look at the book, you'll see that there are notes all over the place in there about who said what. But you don't really get the sense and the scope of that story unless you've got all of that verification. And so far, I haven't had anybody question me about anything I've said.
Wow.
So I hope they don't. I really tried hard not to make a mistake.
How many editions have you published since the original?
There are just 3 editions. The first one, like I said, we just self-published, and the missionaries contacted us and asked for a copy. The second one, Granite did that, and they actually put them in bookstores. So they didn't just go out to the missionaries' families. So there are a few of those, and now you can get it. I think Deseret Book has some copies, but you can get it online at Amazon. Mm-hmm. It's an ebook or paperback.
Amazon has
tried to keep the cost down on it. Yes?
Yeah, it's an important story.
I think it is.
Are there any parts of all the stories that you collected that stand out to you? We know about Norm Siebold through escape from Germany.
Yes.
But you were also mentioning Grant Weber as well was an important story to you.
Well, it was important in the way that I found him, because I realized that was just inspiration. I realized that, sometimes I feel like Heavenly Father is going, oh, look at Terry. She's so cute. She's working so hard. Let's help her a little bit.
Oh.
I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for those incidences. The other ones that kind of were very touching were the Vern Merritt's story. And of course, Grant Baker's story. I think he was one of the ones that would have fought back if somebody tried to push him or something. And, of course, Norm's story was important. Irma's story was important. There are many stories that missionaries told me that they were witnesses to that were important. But interestingly enough, the World War II eclipsed their missions. And I heard stories about a lot of World War II stories. Some of them were just heart-wrenching. One of the missionaries, I had a tough time finding him. I finally did. And he was a retired brigadier general. He'd spent his whole life in the military. And at first he didn't want to talk to me, and so I called him back later and asked if he felt like telling me about his experience. So then he told me a little bit about it, and then he told me that he was no longer a member of the church, that he'd been excommunicated.
Oh, wow.
And, but he was still my missionary. And I didn't care. I just wanted to hear what his experience was. And it got to the point where sometimes I get frustrated by something that I'd read or heard, and I'd call him and I'd say, do you know what was on the news? He'd say, now, Sister Terry, just calm down. It's all right. This will pass away. But every once in a while, he'd start drinking, and he'd call me. And once he told me that after they'd had a battle during World War II, he'd take a flashlight at night and go out amongst the dead on the battlefield to see if there were any members that he knew, that he might have killed members that he knew. And then he would cry, and then I would cry. So it wasn't all wonderful stuff, like I said, World War II, I think, eclipsed those really marvelous things that happened with those missionaries just because they were missionaries. But there were other things that happened too. And there were miracles that happened in the course of World War II. Do you know there was not one of those missionaries that was killed in combat?
Really?
Not one.
Wow.
I was astonished by that. But that is also one of the reasons why I chose the title Mine Angels Roundabout, was because when you read that whole section called The Oath and Covenant of the Priesthood, and it's all about what, we're supposed to be doing, and then what the promise is if we are faithful in that. And that phrase, the first time I heard it was when I had just started collecting the stories. And our gospel doctrine teacher read the scripture and said, "Mine angels round about you to bear you up." And I thought, that's the name of this book. It's about how the Savior's angels were there to bear them up. And then later, as I got to know them and hear about their lives, I could see that for the faithful ones, and there were a lot of them, there were mission presidents and regional representatives and bishops and stake presidents, people who have served 4 and 5 missions. And in every one of those stories over a lifetime, you could see the hand of the Lord in their lives. And I thought, it works for people who aren't missionaries too, or those missionaries who went out with that promise and then served with that promise for the rest of their lives. And it shows. If you look, if you're willing to sit and listen, you'll see it, you'll hear it, you'll see it.
Wow. Just so many incredible stories all around.
There are.
I'm just so curious. There were several miracles. I mean, what people would call them are miracles that would happen during this time. Are there any that really stand out to you as you go through these stories?
Well, all of them do.
All of them. No, how do you pick just a few? Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know, because some of them you would have to know the person to understand the impact. One of my favorite people is Fred Dohlmeyer, and he was one of the ones that joined Hitler's Youth. He'd go off and play basketball with the Nazis, the officers, baseball with the Hitler's Youth kids, and he. What was hard for him, and what was a miracle for him, was that he had been born in northern Germany, and when he was 9, his parents, who were converts, moved the whole family to Salt Lake, and that's where he was raised. When he was standing in those lines to try and evacuate, standing in the lines to get his papers stamped, standing in the line to get on the train, he knew on his passport it said that he was born in Germany. And those officers who were going through that paperwork were always telling these young men, well, you should stay here. We'll make you an Obermeister. You can speak English and you can speak German. So, when we conquer the United States, you could be an officer. And Fred Dohlmeyer was standing there, and he was scared. He was scared because that really could have happened with him. And maybe the officer who was looking at his passport and his papers had seen so many of those that day, maybe he just flipped through it and didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't see it at all, or maybe it wasn't there to be seen. Anyway, that officer did not have the eyes to see that Fred Dohlmeyer was born in Germany. And he got on the train. He got to Holland. And that's another interesting story, too, is that so many of them were able to get through those checkpoints because, I think, of members of the church. Because Brother Dohlmeyer and his companion were waiting in a line to get on the train after he'd passed through those checkpoints. And they saw a man in a uniform come out of another building on the other side of the train yard. And he came over close to them and just gestured very discreetly to follow him. Didn't say anything, just kind of follow me. And they picked up their bags and they followed him. And he took them through the train yard and around a building and put them on a train. And they just had sat down on that train when it left. They didn't know who that was, but it was somebody who knew about LDS missionaries who were trying to evacuate. When I asked them, who do you think that was? They said, well, it was probably a member who was inspired to watch for us. So, there were things like that. And usually it's the little things, I think, that strengthen a person in whatever capacity they have, that all of us can do little things when we're inspired to do little things. They don't have to be things like threatening to punch out a city policeman like Norm did, although I wouldn't put that past Norm at all. I knew him. But there are other members who do quiet things that make a big difference.
Wow, this is such an incredible work that you've done. Do you get people that still come to you today and say, oh, I have something else to add, or has that kind of slowed down?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I still do. About a month ago, I think we were at a fireside, and there were two people who approached me and said, this is my grandfather's story, or told me about something that happened in their family in relation to governments that were not democratic. Problems that people had had with governments and how they were threatened. And so, yeah, that does happen still when I get in a group. And that's okay. I want to hear them.
Yeah. Do you think you would make another book at any point, or do you feel like one book captures what you were intending?
Yes and no. I prefer writing small things, short articles. I prefer nonfiction. I like doing stories about ordinary people who have been in extraordinary circumstances. And there's a place for those stories. I've thought about going back over 20 years and collecting the stories I like the most and putting them in one compilation. And I've had some people say, oh, yeah, you should do that. But our daughter passed away, and she has children, and those children are living with us now. And so they're the ones that take most of my energy, most of my attention.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you don't see something in Meridian magazine or on, one of the other magazines that I've done, it's because I have another calling right now.
Mm-hmm.
Later, maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many different things, so many different works that...
Stories in the world.
Yeah, that we do.
I went over to the historical department, a bunch of years ago, maybe 15 years ago, and one of the archivists there is someone who I trust. And I said, have you got any more evacuation stories? And he says, no, we don't talk about those anymore. But evidently they're still going on. I was introduced to one of the prophets, and what he said to me was, what do you know that you did not put in the book?
Really?
Busted. Because so many of them told me, now, don't you tell anyone this. Don't you tell anyone this happened. Don't you tell anyone that I did this. And so when he asked me, what do you know that you didn't put in the book? Well, it was because I was asked not to. But, you're sitting there with a prophet. So I said, yes, there is. So then we had a little discussion about what that was about. And then later on I heard that from someone who's well-connected in the church office building that they had changed some of the guidelines and instructions about evacuations. So, and I didn't ask any further.
Do you think you had a hand in that?
I don't know.
Maybe.
I don't want to know either.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Oh, what a story. Oh, my gosh. Wow.
But there was just this micro nanosecond when I thought, You could say no, but I did not.
Yeah, it's the prophet that you're that you're sitting with.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you have another book too, with Fireweed. Did you kind of write it at the same time as Mine Angel's Roundabout, or what did the timeline look for that one?
That was about 4 or 5 years after. There was that time period there. Because I did have to do a lot of research, and I still I've always kept my research. And for Fireweed, I kept an entire Rubbermaid box full of 3x5 cards that would have this is what a normal German family would have been eating for lunch during the time of rationing. I tried to make it that detailed.
Wow.
And I've had people say to me, well, some woman that she had an accent. She was from Poland. And she told me she couldn't read it because it gave her nightmares. She had flashbacks because she, as it turned out, had been a Polish slave in Berlin. And that's where I said the story was in Berlin. So I guess it was close enough for a person who had been there. And other people just liked it. It got good reviews in the papers, even in the Salt Lake Trib.
Do you think you would ever let it go into a movie adaptation as well?
A lot of people have suggested that, but I don't know. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I really haven't thought about that. It was just a way to use up all of that information that I had. And there was a time when I would go looking for a book, like maybe I'd be in the grocery store and there'd be a stack of, novels. And so I'd think, well, I need something to read this week. And I'd pull the book out and the cover was objectionable, so I'd put it back. And I remember one day standing in the grocery store in front of the book rack, thinking, I don't want to read anything that's in here. And I noticed there was a woman who was not very far from me, younger than me, and she was pregnant, and she had a toddler hanging on her leg who was whining and crying, because you get into the grocery store and kids get tired. Yeah. And she was looking for a book. And I thought, she can't find anything that's helping her with the situation she's in, even if it's a novel. There should be something for her. And so I had her in mind then when I started Fireweed, was that this is for someone who needs some encouragement over the stresses and difficulties in their own lives. And I can probably do that for her. So she's always the person that I think about when I think about doing something fictional, because obviously that's what she was looking for. But I don't know who she was, but that's who I think about.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it sounds like you've heard so much, you've experienced so much from gathering all these stories and hearing from these people. Do you think that there's a possibility that more could open up, or?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know about in my lifetime, but maybe it would inspire somebody else to do something similar, or to find something similar, or have that jolt that says, this is what you need to do right now. Mm-hmm. And you need to do it for these people. And so I think the most successful writers don't just write for themselves. I think they do it for someone else, to help someone else.
Yeah. With both of these books, Fireweed and Mine Angel's Roundabout, did it affect your faith personally?
Well, I would say that because I I was certainly schooled in listening to the Spirit, recognizing that voice, recognizing when there was something I needed to say or do. The encouragement to be enthused about what I was doing. So I could keep up my energy levels and I could keep going. And I happened to have a really good friend who was also a writer, and she was always the one that was so excited when, I'd say, look, I got a letter from my missionary, and she was right there. She's, oh, what did they say? So she was enthused about that too. And in times when I was discouraged about something, she would say, yeah, Terry, the Lord loves this book. So then I'd keep going.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Do you have anything else that you would like to add or anything else you would like listeners to know?
I think TC did a really good job of telling those few stories that he could. Obviously couldn't tell all of them. And not all of them were as Clint Eastwood, like Norm was. The Norm I knew was like that, truly. But there are a lot of other stories, and I think TC did a really good job of conveying the spirit of that entire event.
Yeah. You were saying that when the missionaries were watching it, they were like mannequins.
Yeah, the whole audiences, teenagers, older folks, they were still on their seats. They were, I think, because they recognized the spirit of the story. I had a friend from high school. I haven't seen him in maybe 50 years. And we had the premiere here at the Wilson Theater, which is a gorgeous kind of Gilded Age theater. And TC allowed us to have one of the premieres here. And this kid that I knew from the time I was in primary, and I haven't seen him since high school, actually came up here to see it. He lives somewhere down around Salt Lake. And he told me, he said, I saw Norm's name on the screen, and then I saw your name on the screen, and I just cried. And I thought it was so interesting that it was just even the reminder of the faith of those missionaries would touch him like that. And a lot of people say things like that to me, too. I was at LDS PMA last month, and people would come up to me and say, I love that book. I love that music, that movie. And I'd say, oh, thank you. And then they'd say, I love that book. I love that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have a lot of other words to express how they felt about that. And I think that is the way sometimes the Spirit reaches us, is beyond words.
Yeah, I remember when I was there at the theater watching it, like everyone was just silent walking out.
Yes.
And
yes.
Same way with the book. I mean, just so many wonderful stories that you put in there that we get access to beyond the Norm Siebold story. And
yeah. I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for the work that you do, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.